Are you following all the same writing advice, but your dialogue still sounds stiff? Dialogue is the best way to engage your readers, but it's also the hardest thing to get right. As an English professor, I've seen even the best students in my creative nonfiction workshop struggle with dialogue. That is, until they learn a few simple tricks. So in this video, I'm going to show you the easiest way to write dialogue that's engaging and authentic. Dialogue that brings your characters to life and your readers right there in the room with them, using examples from fiction, nonfiction, and screenwriting along the way. Plus, I'm going to show you the silent dialogue hack that turned There Will Be Blood into a cinematic masterpiece. By the end of this video, not only will you know what makes these iconic examples of dialogue so engaging, but you'll also know how to write it yourself. And if you like learning about the art and science of expert writing, then you are going to love my free newsletter, Writer Science. Link is down below the like button. Last week, as I was preparing for this video, I went back and rewatched There Will Be Blood because it's just a shining example of some of the best dialogue in cinema. And even though I've probably watched that movie 10 to 15 times, this time I noticed something particular that completely changed how I see the film. And we're gonna get to that, but for now, let me just ask you this. The title of the film, There Will Be Blood. Why do you think it has that title? Keep that in mind, because when you understand this about dialogue, the title and so much more about that movie is going to suddenly make a lot more sense. Speaking of films, have you ever watched a movie with somebody who keeps pausing it to explain what's happening?
Hey man, watch this part. This part is really good.
Those guys are the worst. It totally ruins the experience, right? Unfortunately, this is exactly what so many writers do to their readers, and the worst part is, they don't even realize it. Take Stephen King, for example. Now, nobody's gonna say that Stephen King is not a great writer. He's a master storyteller. But when it comes to dialogue, well, it's not exactly his strong suit. When I read dialogue in Stephen King, I'm reminded of that famous scene from Woody Allen's Annie Hall, where subtitles appear beneath the conversation to explicitly spell out the character's inner thoughts.
Yeah, I sort of dabble around, you know.
They're wonderful, you know. They have a quality.
Well, I would like to take a serious photography course.
Photography is interesting because, you know, it's a new art form and a set of aesthetic criteria have not emerged yet.
Aesthetic criteria? You mean whether it's a good photo or not?
The medium enters in as a condition of the art form itself.
Now you'll see the same kind of commentary in a scene from Stephen King's novel Carrie, in which Sue and Tommy, who are a young couple, they've just finished making love in Tommy's car. Sue thought herself suddenly loathsome. She found she could not bear that, and so she twisted it at him. When did you start making all these big moral decisions? After you started fucking me? She saw the good humor fade from his face and was sorry. Guess I should have just kept quiet, he said, and pulled up his pants. It's not you, it's me. She put a hand on his arm. I'm ashamed, see? I know, he said, but I shouldn't be giving advice. I'm not very good at it. Tommy, do you ever hate being so, well, popular? Me? The question wrote surprise on his face. Contrast that with these few lines of dialogue from Cormac McCarthy's All the Pretty Horses, which won the National Book Award. In this scene, the protagonist, John Grady Cole, meets with his father in a cafe. The father and the son are somewhat estranged, and John Grady has just learned that his father sold the deed to the family ranch, so it's a little bit awkward. His father smoked. He watched him. You still seeing that Barnett girl? He shook his head. She quit you or did you quit her? I don't know. That means she quit you. Yeah. His father nodded. He smoked. Two horsemen passed outside the road, and they studied them and the animals they rode. His father stirred his coffee a long time. There was nothing to stir because he drank it black. He took the spoon and laid it smoking on the paper napkin and raised the cup and looked at it and drank it. He was still looking out the window, although there was nothing there to see. Your mother and me never agreed on a whole lot. She liked horses. I thought that was enough. That's how dumb I was. Did you spot the difference? Look in the text. McCarthy is nowhere to be found. The author doesn't intrude on the scene to interrupt the dialogue or spell out the emotional subtext. He trusts his readers to connect the dots, and that's what makes the dialogue so engaging. Now, I want to double click on that word engaging, because it's kind of cliche, but I really mean it in its truest sense. Pure dialogue engages the reader. It invites them to participate in the meaning making. And that kind of dialogue feels more genuine. It's closer to the real thing because in real life, we honestly have no idea what's going on inside the mind of others. So why should an author presume to know a character's intentions and private thoughts? And more importantly, why should their narrative put us in that position of knowing? This kind of authorial assistance is called author-splaining. When the author butts into a scene to clarify every emotion or thought behind his character's words, and it's one of the cardinal sins of dialogue. So how can you avoid the trap of author-splaining? Well, as with mansplaining, the way to avoid author-splaining is to assume that the other person might have ideas of their own. There are some language forms that are a clear tell. Adverbs that modify verbs of speech, essentially any word that ends with ly, which comes after words like said, are a dead giveaway that the author is trying to explain the meaning of dialogue. Delete them. Really, go ahead, delete them. I know, you wrote these adverbs because you're trying to be helpful, but they're just a crutch for bad writing. Instead, put yourself in that emotional mindset and think of word choices and body language that seem to flow naturally from that emotion. Similarly, phrases that explicitly refer to emotional states are doing the same work. They're adding a layer of commentary on what can otherwise be shown through actions and dialogue. The words a character chooses or doesn't choose, and the way those language choices play against the context, tell us an awful lot about their intentions and emotional state. So trust your readers to interpret the dialogue. When you step back, you invite your readers forward, and this creates a more immersive and, yes, engaging reading experience. Have you ever had that kind of immersive, engaging reading experience where the dialogue stays with you long after you close the book? I'm talking about those really significant lines on which your entire interpretation of the story hinges. Those lines of dialogue that you want to talk to your friends about afterwards. Well, when you're writing dialogue, something to consider is, what's the purpose of dialogue? Like, in the story, why at this moment are we, the author, deciding to break off from the narrative and go into dialogue? These are two different modes of storytelling, and they serve different purposes. Flat dialogue is more or less the same as narrative. It's just a straightforward description of speech events. But dialogue that carries multiple meanings invites readers to actively engage in the story, and it gets them emotionally and intellectually invested in your story. Let me give you a simple example, an exchange between a husband and wife. So the husband says, "I think I'll go over to the pub now for a drink." "Will you be long?" "Why don't you come too?" "I don't think I will. Not tonight." "I'm not sure. I may." "Well, which is it?" "I don't need to say now, do I? If I feel like it, I'll come over later." Notice how each line of this dialogue subtly shifts the meaning of the passage as a whole. Her first response, "Will he be long?" opens itself to a few interpretations. Like, is she planning to do something while he's away, hoping that he'll be gone for long enough? Is she tired of him and she wants some time to herself? Is she feeling needy, worried that he'll be gone too long? Now notice he answers her question with another question. "Why don't you come too?" Now, is he sincere? Does he want her to come? She answers his invitation with hesitation, uncertainty. Why is she hesitating? What is she turning over in her mind? In her decision about whether to join her husband at the pub, what is she weighing in the balance? And when he presses her, well, which is it? The line opens up to multiple interpretations. Is he irritated, or is he feeling resigned? Does he genuinely want her to join him, or is he secretly hoping that she'll decline? This ambiguity is a powerful writing tool. By leaving room for interpretation, you invite readers to become co-creators in your story. They'll fill in the emotional gaps, deciding for themselves what's really happening beneath the surface. And this active participation creates a stronger bond between your readers and your story. It gives them something to ponder, discuss, and debate long after they've put down your book. So, how do you actually write dialogue with multiple meanings? Well, whenever you're writing dialogue, it's important to remember that you must resist the urge to spell out every emotion or intention explicitly. Instead, leave intentional gaps or even subtle contradictions. Also, watch out for long passages that might be revealing too much, and consider whether certain lines might be viewed differently by different readers. Now, of course, you don't want your dialogue to be totally vague and vapid, but challenge yourself to write lines that could mean different things to different readers. When readers are invited to come up with their own interpretations, they become sewed up into your story. That interpretation is an extension of themselves. It draws them in and keeps them invested in your story. But now, let's flip the script. Instead of looking at what's said, let's think about when things are not said, because sometimes the most powerful moments in storytelling happen when nothing is said at all. And this is the key that unlocked my epiphany about There Will Be Blood. Now, think about it this way. How can you highlight a character's embarrassment or shame without explicitly describing it? The thing that's so cringy about that Stephen King dialogue is that rather than conveying those feelings with subtle dialogue, he hits you over the head with explicit descriptions of their inner states. And when the author inserts themselves to describe emotions, all you're left with is some flat, one-dimensional dialogue. But when you're writing about embarrassment, what's the alternative? After all, in waking life, when we feel embarrassment or shame, we don't generally say it outright. We usually try to hide what we're embarrassed of. Here's a more subtle approach that you can use to convey these deeper emotions. Take this scene from A House for Mr. Biswas from V.S. Naipaul. People have been roasting me in the comments lately for my pronunciation, and again, this is just something that happens when you read these words and you never heard them said, so I'm taking a stab here, but I'm calling him Mr. Biswas. So in this scene, it's Christmas Eve, and Mr. Biswas decides on a whim to buy a doll's house for his daughter. He can't afford it. It's going to cost him a month's wages. So it's really a scene of aspiration, longing, and humiliation. He got off his bicycle and leaned it against the curb. Before he had taken off his bicycle clips, he was accosted by a heavy-lidded shopman who repeatedly sucked his teeth. The shopman offered Mr. Biswas a cigarette and lit it for him. Words were exchanged. Then, with the shopman's arm around his shoulders, Mr. Biswas disappeared into the shop. Not many minutes later, Mr. Biswas and the shopman reappeared. They were both smoking and excited. A boy came out of the shop, partly hidden by the large doll's house he was carrying. The doll's house was placed on the handlebar of Mr. Biswas's cycle, and with Mr. Biswas on one side and the boy on the other, wheeled down the high street. Notice what's happening here. There isn't a single line of dialogue. The entire exchange is reported to us, as though the author set up a camera outside the shop window. We know Mr. Biswas, and we know he can't afford the doll's house, but we don't know what's being said inside, and certainly we want to know. But that dialogue is left out. The reader is left outside to infer what's being said from the action, as though we were watching a silent film. And in an even stronger move, the author deliberately avoids showing us the embarrassing transaction itself. Instead, we are told words were exchanged. The passive language is perfect here. It emphasizes his lack of control as he's maneuvered through this scene. Mr. Biswas is accosted. The doll's house was placed on the handlebars of his bike, and Mr. Biswas is wheeled down the street. It's funny, but it's also quite painful, because the real action, the moment that the money changes hands, is too humiliating to depict. This narrative shows tremendous sympathy for Mr. Biswas, seeming to look away from a scene that's just too embarrassing to report directly. By intentionally omitting the dialogue and focusing on passive actions, the story shows us Mr. Biswas's shame without directly stating it. And that silence, the absence of dialogue, is precisely what makes the scene so powerful. It works perfectly in this scene, but the question is, how can you use it in your own writing? Well, the next time you're writing a scene where a character experiences deep embarrassment or vulnerability, experiment with silence. Unlike Stephen King, who needs to spell out every painful detail, try stepping back and describing the scene indirectly. Let your readers feel the weight of what's not being said.
You have to listen to the notes she's not playing.
I can do that at home.
Often, the strongest emotional impact comes from what's left unspoken, which brings me back to There Will Be Blood. Now, if you've come this far into a video about dialogue, then I think it's safe to assume that you've already seen the film. It's a masterpiece, but just in case, let me set up this scene, which occurs about 2/3 of the way through the film. So the movie is about Daniel Plainview, a hardcore oil man in the early 1900s who's played by Daniel Day-Lewis. He's all about money and power no matter who gets in his way. But now, standing in his way is Eli Sunday, this young preacher who's running the Church of the Third Revelation in a dusty little town where Daniel is trying to drill for oil. They've been butting heads for a while. Daniel has already embarrassed Eli once by shutting him out of a blessing of an oil rig. And when Eli tried to confront Daniel in front of the men on his job site, well, that did not go very well for him.
I'm gonna bury you underground, Eli. I'm gonna bury you underground.
But now, Daniel Plainview needs something from Eli, a piece of land from one of the members of his church where he'd like to build a pipeline. And Eli's like, oh, you want the land? Well, you better get baptized first. So now it's Daniel walking onto Eli's turf. He's actually just killed someone the night before, and he's never stepped foot in a church before. So you could say he's feeling a little out of place. Eli calls Daniel up to the pulpit, and he's just loving every second of this. He starts grilling Daniel, making him confess all of his sins in front of everybody, including one that really cuts to the bone.
I'm a sinner.
Louder, Daniel! I am a sinner!
I am a sinner.
I am sorry, Lord!
I am sorry, Lord.
I want the blood!
I want the blood.
You have abandoned your child!
I've abandoned my child.
I will never backslide.
I will never backslide.
I was lost, but now I am found!
I was lost, but now I'm found.
I have abandoned my child! Say it.
I've abandoned my child.
Say it louder. Say it louder!
I've abandoned my child! I've abandoned my child! I've abandoned my boy!
But this is where things get interesting, because after the baptism, the camera starts pulling away, and then you notice that Daniel approaches Eli to shake his hand, and he says something to him. We don't know what. That totally wipes the grin off of Eli's face.
In the blood of the Lamb, there is power.
What did he say? That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that's open to interpretation. It's a question that the writer and director, Paul Thomas Anderson, wants us to ask. It's the only time this kind of muted dialogue happens in the film, and in fact, it's the only time I can think of that it's happened in any of his films. And it provokes such a strong reaction in Eli. You know that it's something bad. But like the scene that we just read with Mr. Biswas, we're left outside of that dialogue and we kind of have to piece it together. But as I watched the film this time around, I think I figured it out. So as the camera is pulling back, the song that the congregation is singing is "There is power, power, power in the blood."
There's power in the blood. Power in the blood.
It's a reference to the blood of Christ, but as Daniel approaches Eli, what I think he must say, the thing that makes the title make so much sense is, oh, There will be blood. The technical name for this style of dialogue is ellipsis, when you strategically leave something out, and it's a great tool for engaging your readers, but it's only one writing tool, and it'll take more than ellipsis if you want to write masterful dialogue. So for 31 other writing tools, you need to check out this video next, because it's going to show you a list of the best writing tools that I've ever come across in fiction, nonfiction, cinema, and even Monty Python. So be sure to go check it out.